All right, we're good to go, I think, right?
Yep, sounds good. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm not a research forester. I'm a research soil scientist. I guess that's the first thing. But welcome, everyone, to our presentation on SPRUCE, the spruce and peatland responses in our changing environments experiment on the Marcel experimental forest. I'm going to just give a really brief overview of both Marcel and spruce and then talk about some of the below ground processes. Marcel's been going on for over 60 years now. It was established around 1960. And it was really established in our experimental forest network across the U.S. to study wetlands. And wetlands were not part of our experimental forest network at the time in 1960. And it just so happens these wetlands are these very carbon-rich peatlands in northern Minnesota. And so at the very beginning, we were just trying to understand the hydrology, ecology, and soils of these ecosystems for many years. And then in the 70s and 80s, we started looking at different management experiments on peatland watersheds. We harvested uplands, we harvested peatlands, we burned peatlands, we ditched peatlands. We did all kinds of different things. And then we looked into biogeochemical cycling when the acid rain days hit and are still ongoing, especially with regards to sulfate deposition, which has some implications for mercury cycling, which I won't get into today, but we started mercury cycling in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's about the same time we were starting to see changes in our climate was in the late 80s. And since about 1960, we went about 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit over the 60 years of Marcel. So our growing season, for example, is about 3 weeks longer than it was in 1960. That's just a little intro to Marcel. So spruce intro, any metric you want to use, it's the largest climate change experiment on the planet. If you think about people involved in the research and the implication it has for our future climate, it's the biggest ever, and it's in a peatland here in northern Minnesota. So if you haven't seen it yet or you haven't heard about it yet, there's only a few years left. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And it's really an experiment to assess these high carbon northern peatland ecosystems, and what we're doing is we're warming the soil and the temperature and the air. And we also are doing an elevated carbon dioxide component to it. As most folks know, there's a fertilizer effect of CO2. And so we're adding that as well to get all the aspects of climate change to assess. Funded mainly by the Department of Energy, Office of Science, and it's basically a co-op between us and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, DOE's big facility in Tennessee, and we literally got over hundreds of collaborators from across the planet working on spruce. It was an understudied ecosystem, although it's starting to get its day, especially because of all the carbon that it stores, as well as permafrost in Arctic regions are really getting a lot of research done. 20 years ago, you wouldn't say that. Really have the potential to show dramatic carbon shifts and organism responses under climate change. And we're sort of at the southern extent of peatlands here in northern Minnesota. They get further south, but maybe the southern ones are most vulnerable to climate change, and that seems to be the case. Actually, I don't know about the southern extent, but the northern extent is moving north. So these peatland zones are shifting. And really, it's about greenhouse gas feedbacks to the atmosphere, the ones that drive our climate forcing gases, CO2 and methane. These peatlands are very important sources and sinks for those. And really what DOE wants to do is enhance our global circulation model so they can predict our future climate and then predict our future energy needs. And if and when those energy needs need to change or start moving in other directions away from fossil fuels, for example. Warming gets greater as you go further north in the upper right panel, and you can see there's a little nib there in northern Minnesota. It comes right down. We're very much like middle to northern Canada. And we have been seeing greater changes here in Minnesota than we have been in nearby states like Wisconsin, for example. You can see the long-term global average temperature is going up, 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 up. And then in the bottom left is our spruce peatland, actually. And we did a bathymetry map using a couple of different methods. So that's the bottom of the map. It's just like a lake map inside the peatland there. And in one place there, the peat depth in that left-hand corner is over 30 feet deep. So that's a lot of carbon. If you look at just the carbon stored in that little 20-acre peatland, it's about the same as about 110,000 flights from Bemidji to Minneapolis-St. Paul for some context. We have 10 chambers in spruce, 5 different temperature treatments. Each one of those temperature treatments has a ambient and an elevated carbon dioxide. The temperature treatments, if we look at Fahrenheit, are ambient to 16 degrees Fahrenheit. So last Sunday here, last Sunday or 2 Sundays ago, I guess, Labor Day weekend Sunday, we had 95 here in Grand Rapids. So it's literally 111 inside of that spruce chamber. So it's always a differential from outside the temperature, both above and below ground, 24/7, 365. So, yeah, it's a differential from whatever the outside temperature is all year long. And then we also have elevated carbon dioxide, which is about twice what we're breathing right now. We're breathing about 420. 900 is about what's projected for the year 2100. We also have unchambered controls, so you can't just put a chamber around an ecosystem and expect everything to be equal. And there are some caveats that we need to understand about putting chambers and containing ecosystems. And so if you look at a schematic of spruce, a spruce chamber, you can see the diameters and whatnot. We also have a below ground component to it where we isolate the hydrology basically. They're kind of all sort of baby catchments, tiny watersheds, and we get the runoff that occurs in the spring and other big events just like it naturally would. And we measure chemistry of that water coming out. But the really novel aspect of spruce is the below ground heating. No one's been able to figure out how to heat the ground far and wide and deep before without a ton of disturbance or very near surface sort of warming. And some of the engineers at Oak Ridge figured that if you put a heating coil into the ground, much like you'd have on your electric heater, but you make it about, 6 feet long, and you put it in the ground, that electricity, it creates a certain aura around that pipe to the right-hand corner there. And if you put those pipes in a certain geometry, and that geometry is concentric circles, you can heat as far and wide as deep as you want with very little disturbance. So that is really novel, and that's what separates spruce from anything that's ever been done before, is the soil heating. If you think about our hypothesis, on the left, on the y-axis, the relative response can be any of hundreds of things we're measuring, and the temperature differentials on the bottom there. Again, that's back in Celsius. Sorry about that, but 9 is 16 on the end there. And you can imagine something like spruce growth rate. Maybe spruce likes it for a little while, and it gets greater and greater with higher temperatures, and maybe even likes it a little more, the red dots with elevated CO2. And then it just gets too hot. The spruce just can't handle those kind of temperatures, and they start going downhill. You can imagine every kind of response surface, not just the up and down, but responses in all different directions and all different kinds based on whatever response we're measuring. Those are the algorithms, those are the relationships that DOE wants to put in their climate change models. And so here's an overhead of spruce. And here's an overhead, so that's looking straight down on one with a drone, obviously. And I'm not going to go through this at all, but suffice to say that if we're going to spend this kind of money and develop these kind of resources to put an experiment like this on the ground, we're going to try to measure everything we can think of. And you can see in the bottom there that space is at a premium inside the spruce chamber for experiments. We began all this crazy stuff in 2009. We finally started the below ground heating after a bunch of environmental assessments and NEPA. And we started the below ground heating in June of 2014, above in 2015, and the full experiment where we added elevated CO2 in 2016. And we're going to run the experiment for 10 years starting in 2016. So our last field season actually is 2025, and we'll go through a decommissioning phase after that. Just a few interesting results from a below ground nutrient cycling point of view before I hand it off to Andrew. We are definitely hemorrhaging greenhouse gases with warming. And so these ecosystems have been long-term sinks actually since the last glacial period about 11,000 years ago for carbon. In other words, they've been housing carbon and bringing in carbon into them and mitigating our greenhouse gases in our atmosphere for the last 11,000 years. And by warming, we're starting to flip that switch from being a sink to a source. And I'll show you more on that in just a second. And then this is an interesting one too. You know, a lot of that carbon is really old, thousands of years old. And if you look on the figure to the left, the black figure, black and white figure, that far line really is the age of the peat itself. And that far one down at 200 centimeters on the far left corner is about 11,000 years old. And all the ones to the right of that are the pore water carbon age, and near the surface are the carbon that's coming out of the soil. And so you look at that and we thought, wow, right away, it looks really good. We're not mining that deep carbon that's been stored a long time, because we start mining that deep carbon, then I think we're really in trouble. Well, we redid that study relatively recently, and all the ones on the left are the blues and yellows on the right, and the new study ones are the reds and oranges, and you can see that that line is moving towards getting older. And so now we are starting to maybe mine some of that deeper carbon, deeper old carbon, and we'll never get that back again. It is truly mining. And so if you get out your checkbook and you look at all the inputs and outputs of carbon on an annual basis, again, they've been gaining carbon for 11,000 years on average, even with relatively minor increases in mean annual temperature. We're flipping them from being a gainer to a loser, from a sink to a source. And if we really get towards the end of that temperature treatment scale, we are really flipping them to being huge sources to the atmosphere. To the extent that we're actually seeing changes in the elevation with warming. And so we've blown off about 2.5 inches in the warmest chambers of elevation as a result of loss of the carbon in these ecosystems. And it probably takes several hundred years, maybe 500 years, to get that 2.5 inches built, and we just blew it off in a few years with the warmest chambers. So we didn't anticipate seeing changes in elevation actually as a result of the treatments. We may get into this with some of the other talks, but one of the ecosystems, or one of the plant communities that's winning big time in lieu of trees and the sphagnum. The sphagnum story is a pretty bad one, in that we're losing the sphagnum, which is actually the smallest plant, but the building block of these ecosystems. That's why there's so much carbon there. We're starting to lose the sphagnum, mainly because the shrubs are dominating, and it's partially because of the fine root of the shrubs. And roots increase with temperature, and specifically it's the nitrogen, it's the ammonia that is going up. And so these are nitrogen starved systems. Because of elevated temperature, we're decomposing more things, getting greater available nutrients with increasing temperature as well. And that has a direct relationship to shrub productivity, also has some relationship to tree productivity as well, probably, but not as much. The shrubs seem to be winning more than the trees, and a lot more than the sphagnum, unfortunately. And I'll stop right there, and I'll hand it over to Andrew, and I'll stop sharing. If I can.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, and we're seeing your slides here.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'm Andrew Richardson. I'm a professor at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. I first visited SPRUCE, I think, in 2012 or so, before the experiment was set up, and I've been doing work there since 2015, when the warming was turned on. And I got auto-advancing stuff, which is not supposed to happen. I'm going to talk today about phenology and climate change, and why it matters, and what we're learning from SPRUCE. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to distinguish between phrenology, which is the study of bumps on the head and is often what people think I'm talking about when I say phenology, and phenology, which is the study of seasonality and seasonal rhythms, or as defined by the American Heritage Dictionary, the scientific study of periodic biological phenomena such as flowering, breeding, and migration in relation to climatic conditions. And the images here are just showing classic examples of different types of phenology. We've got spring emergence and flowering by plants, insect metamorphoses, migration of birds and mammals, as well as the ripening of fruits and crops and autumn coloration and senescence. So there's a lot of different phenological events that scientists are interested in. And the point is that phenology is really around us, all around us, all of the time. As we cycle through the seasons, new phenological events are constantly occurring. Now, phenology is inherently of interest to ecologists because it represents this point of intersection between organisms and their growth environment. But phenology is also of interest to the general public. Humans just tend to be inherently fascinated by the passing of the seasons and the ways in which symbols of this passing are manifest. And phenology has been referred to as the pulse of our planet and the rhythm of the seasons. And this rhythm is really nicely captured by this video, which is derived from NASA remote sensing, showing the annual cycles of vegetation development and senescence across the globe. And you can see there's that pulsing rhythm going on as the seasons pass. So one of my main research areas is phenology, and you might ask, why is there a deeper reason we might be interested in phenology? Why does it matter? Well, there's substantial evidence for the advancement of spring phenological events, such as leaf out and flowering, by about 2 to 5 days per decade since the 1970s. Randy mentioned that the growing season is now a few weeks longer than it was in 1960. And similarly, there's many examples of autumn phenological events, such as leaf coloration and senescence, occurring later. And these studies, they show conclusively that the growing season is changing, and these are widely reported both in the scientific literature and the popular press. And then in the IPCC's fourth assessment report in 2007, which is the year they were awarded the Nobel Prize, it was concluded that phenology is perhaps the simplest process in which to track changes in the ecology of species in response to climate change. So the big reason that people are interested in phenology these days is it's a highly sensitive and integrated indicator of the biological impacts of climate change. Now, the shifts in phenology are important in many different ways, and these reasons cut across different disciplines. So phenology matters for ecological interaction. So for example, herbivory, competition, pollination, and dispersal. Shifts in phenology also matter for ecosystem services and climate system feedbacks. So you can think about surface albedo, carbon dioxide, and water vapor fluxes, the surface energy budget. And then shifts in phenology are also critically important to human society. And this includes public health issues related to allergens and disease vectors, but also agriculture. You can think of planting and pollination and harvesting, as well as tourism. And I used to live in New England, spent about 20 years living there. And like the upper Midwest, tourism related to leaf peeping and autumn colors is a huge deal. So there's all these different reasons that phenology matters. And there is the SPRUCE experiment, which Randy described, presents a really unique opportunity to look at how warming is affecting phenology. So the SPRUCE experimental design aims to simulate environmental conditions that will be experienced in the latter half of the present century. And at SPRUCE, there's 10 chambers in total, 5 levels of warming from 0 to +9, and 2 levels of carbon dioxide, ambient, at 400 parts per million, and elevated at 800 parts per million. Now, the warming was turned on in the below ground in 2014 and above ground in August 2015, and the CO2 enrichment was turned on in June of 2016. And this gives us a really unique opportunity to look at how warming affects vegetation phenology. And just hold on one second. It gives us a really unique opportunity to look at how warming affects vegetation phenology. It's unique because we're able to study intact ecosystems, the vegetation's mature, and the warming is being applied to the whole ecosystem. And this is a huge advance over phenological studies in greenhouses that are done with seedlings or cuttings of plants that are being grown in growth chambers. Now, the 9-degree warming, Randy mentioned a few weekends ago, where it was really, really warm up there, especially in those +9 chambers. +9 warming is approximately equivalent to moving the entire ecosystem from Grand Rapids, Minnesota to Wichita, Kansas. And there have been days that are even more extreme than a few weeks ago, days when the +9 chambers get to 46 degrees Celsius, 115 Fahrenheit, which is really more like a summer day in Phoenix than what Grand Rapids is ever like in the summertime. We're interested in using the SPRUCE experiment to follow how phenology is affected by the warming treatments. We've got 3 different hypotheses. So if phenological transitions are controlled strictly by temperature, there should be a strong and direct relationship between chamber air temperature and the observed phenological transition date. It's also been suggested that some phenological transitions, such as autumn senescence, are mainly controlled by photoperiod or day length. And if that's the case, the observed phenological transition date should be constant across different chambers, since day length is the same regardless of warming. And it may be, there's a third possibility that photoperiod effects limits the temperature response, so that up to a certain temperature, a certain amount of warming, we see a linear response to increasing temperature, and then it flattens out. And we were interested in looking at how phenological events in spring and fall, whether they follow any one of these 3 hypotheses using the SPRUCE warming treatments. So to do that, we installed digital cameras, or phenocams, in each of the SPRUCE chambers in August of 2015. The cameras are mounted on the south side of each chamber, overlooking the vegetation in that chamber. And they record images every half hour, and the images are posted in near real time to a web page that we have, where we analyze them and extract information about vegetation color. Now, the imagery also gives us this permanent record of the conditions in the chamber at any point in time. And this is just showing the effectiveness of the warming treatments. This is New Year's Day 2016. There was snow in chamber 19. Temperature was about -4 Celsius. And inside chamber 17, which is a +9 plot, it was well above freezing at 5 degrees Celsius. And in addition to being able to use these images to look at the phenological changes, we can also track the progression of the experiment over its 10-year course. This is just showing a picture inside chamber 6, ambient temperature treatment plot, and we can divide this image into 3 different vegetation types. This is showing the larch trees. The larch is a deciduous conifer, black spruce, which is an evergreen conifer. And then we've got this shrub layer consisting of a variety of species, but it's dominated by Labrador tea and leatherleaf. And from those subregions in each picture, we can characterize when things green up in spring and when they green down or senesce in fall. And what we're seeing is that for the 3 different vegetation types, the deciduous larch in this column, the evergreen spruce here, and the shrub layer dominated by the evergreen shrubs, autumn senescence is delayed by warming by about 3 days per 1 degree increase in temperature, and spring green up is advanced by warming by about 2 days per degree Celsius. Now, there's some differences in this temperature sensitivity across the different plant functional types, but overall, what we're seeing is that between the control chambers and the +9 chambers, there's more than 6 weeks difference in the length of the growing season or the active season. You can also see here that the response to temperature is pretty much linear. And the fact that these slopes are significantly different from zero allows us to reject that hypothesis about photoperiod constraining the phenological responses to warming. These patterns have been consistent over time. This is just showing data for larch or tamarack over the 7 years so far. And you can see that in individual years, there's a consistent trend towards increasing or advancing spring with increasing warming. And that occurs in each of those years, which are shown by the different colored dots here. And in autumn, we're also seeing delayed senescence in fall. And we see similar patterns as well for black spruce and shrub that we do here for larch. We've also been had some on the ground human observers who are making direct phenological observations on a variety of different plant species inside the chambers. And the camera results are supported by the ground observations. So we're seeing earlier shoot elongation, earlier leaf growth, earlier flowering, and earlier seed formation. And this is just showing for 2016 and 2017 how those patterns of earlier leaf growth and shoot elongation and so forth, how they vary from 1 year to the next in terms of the, here the x-axis is the sensitivity of those phenological events to warming. So we're seeing between 1 and 4 days advancement per degree Celsius of warming in these phenological events. Randy mentioned the elevated CO2 treatments in the chambers. So far, we're not seeing any effect of that really on phenology. We are seeing that the phenological responses to warming are linear. They don't saturate even at 9 degrees of warming. We're also using the camera data to track some really interesting extreme events. So we had a spring frost damage in 2016. Last summer, we had some heat stress following days where it got to be 45 degrees Celsius in the +9 chambers. And then we're also seeing effects of heavy snow causing some of the trees actually to get so weighted down with snow that they collapse. And these extreme events are just illustrated here in these pictures, this being the extreme heat. You can see how these spruce trees turned brown following the heat in last August. And this is just the extreme, the heavy wet snow that collapsed some trees. So just to summarize, spring events are occurring earlier, autumn events are occurring later, and we're seeing an extension of the active season at spruce that's linearly related to the amount of warming. We expect future extension of the active season under future climate scenarios, so about 1 to 2 weeks for the RCP 4.5 scenario. And with increased warming in the 8.5 scenario, we might see 3 to 6 weeks more extension of the growing season. The camera results are consistent with the ground observations. We're not seeing a CO2 effect to date. Extreme weather events are increasingly a threat to forest health, and we can see that in the spruce treatments as well. And I think it's quite clear that the future seasonal cycles in Minnesota are going to be very different from what we've been accustomed to over the last or recent decades. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to see those results. Really clear pattern showing up there. Let me see if I can share my slides here. You guys able to see this now?
Yes, I'm hearing you loud and clear.
Good. Okay. This is let's see. So I'm not sure how to, let's see if I can move this a little bit. Yeah, I'm Jeff Warren. I'm a tree physiologist. I've got a background in forestry. And I work at Oak Ridge National Lab as a staff scientist. And my interest is in mainly the woody plants. Um, and I'll show you some of those results. I'll also provide a little bit more justification for our work at Spruce. This is something that Andrew just mentioned and Randy mentioned as well. We've got, we're moving into new and different climate patterns as we go into the future. In the past, if we look at these yellow bars on the top, we've got this sort of mean stress level with these different pulse heat and drought waves that come through over time. In the future, we're just going to have more background stress on our ecosystems due to the increasing temperatures. And we'll also have more and larger magnitudes and more variability in these extreme events, as shown by the red bars. And this is important because this sort of chronic stress, even just indicated by the larger yellow bar, has a pretty strong impact on growth rates of forests. This is a model here using a 3PG forest inventory model, basically showing a reference growth rate over 25 years versus just a small reduction in growth rate by 2% or 4% dramatically affects the yield on that site. And so this is what we're looking at into the future. One of the things that we're focused on, I'm going to try to hide this. One of the things that we're really focused on here is shown in this figure. This is basically showing the modeled trajectory of climate change into the future in context of temperatures. And what we see that Randy mentioned was, is the emissions shown by the green of CO2 and methane. There's a lot of uncertainty in how much of this emissions will actually be released. And so that's the biggest uncertainty in where we're headed in the future. And that's really political and socioeconomic sort of decisions about that. What we're interested in is more shown here by the blue range in this trajectory. And this is, how the ecosystems respond to climate change and their response to increasing forcing from the atmosphere, increasing temperatures and their feedbacks. And so our whole goal is to, while we know we're sort of headed up in this trajectory, our whole goal is to narrow this variability down within our models so that we have a better idea and can better manage and predict where we're going to be in the future. And to do that, we use these land models that Randy mentioned. And these are models that basically build up the ecosystem using code. It's using mechanistic functions. It says, how much energy is absorbed, how much light energy is absorbed by the surface of the earth, of the forests, how much evaporation is going on, how much transpiration is going on, the hydraulic cycle, and the biogeochemical cycles dealing with carbon uptake through photosynthesis, loss of carbon through fire, nutrient cycling, below ground processes. And so these are all represented in the model using the best data available. And these models are big. There can be 100,000 lines of code or more. And what we're doing with the SPRUCE project is really to try to improve the data we provide to these models so that they can reduce that uncertainty in that trajectory as we go forward. some of the, and we're using the SPRUCE experiment to do just that. Some of the components that I'm really focused on and interested in are the plants and the woody plants, as well as the sphagnum. But basically understanding gas exchange, how much photosynthesis is going on versus respiration. Does the temperature acclimation occur for photosynthesis? Can it adjust its rate of photosynthesis to achieve greater return at higher temperatures? Then understanding plant water use, plant water stress. How much water is available under these different conditions? How does that affect tree transpiration? And ultimately, how does that affect growth rates? And then we look at lots of other components of the vegetation, the morphology and the chemistry, the anatomy, the phenology, as Andrew mentioned, growth, damage that we've also seen with some of the extreme events that Andrew mentioned, and leaf area index, which is a key indicator of growth rates. So one of the key questions, as I mentioned, was, does photosynthesis acclimate to temperature? And so we have a typical sort of pattern of photosynthesis has a thermal optimum at the top of these curves. And if we increase the growth rate of the trees, does that shift the optimal photosynthesis to the right, to higher temperatures? And when we measure this at the site, we actually see that yes, it does increase the thermal optimum of photosynthesis. And so for a particular temperature, the spruce and the larch here, or the tamarack, both can take up more carbon. Yet one of the things we saw was that the increase in the thermal optimum of photosynthesis, the T opt of A, doesn't keep pace with the rate of warming. And so if we warm up the system by just 1 degree, we're only getting a 0.2, 0.3 increase in the thermal optimum of photosynthesis. And that's important in context of net carbon uptake. If we look at a figure like this, this is showing sort of the temperature response with the relative response with temperature versus for the different components of net carbon uptake. The green dashed line is showing photosynthesis. And so this is showing sort of the thermal optimum of photosynthesis at this point. And as we move beyond that thermal optimum of photosynthesis, we start moving down this dashed line, while at the same time, respiration rates shown by the red dashed line increase exponentially. And so what that means is that the land sink of carbon globally is on the threshold of declining. And this is based on some data from flux tower sites where they've measured forests around the world. Another key component that we're looking at is focused on water stress. And if we look at the spruce chambers, we create a strong increase in the vapor pressure deficit, the aridity of the air shown in this figure on the top left, increasing temperature, increase the VPD, which basically drives more water out of the plants. We can see sort of the plant temperatures in the bottom left here, using drone imaging and showing that the leaves that are cooler are cooler because they're losing water and they're transpiring and cooling themselves off, whereas the other leaves that are much higher temperatures here at 42 degrees are closing their stomata. They're having more stress. They're not able to get enough water. And that's reflected in this upper right corner in their water potentials. The tamarack or the larch is showing much lower water potentials shown here by this circle than the spruce. And so they're under more stress. And part of that stress is because they're keeping their stomata open and they're thus able actually to take up a little bit more carbon. There's some other things that are going on with the plants in context of leaf size. This is leaf mass per area. And the leaves are getting thinner and smaller for the warmer plots. We're also seeing changes in the hydraulic connectivity, how much water the branches and the stems can move through the plants. So lots of different things going on here. A key component is measuring and understanding the water balance in the systems. And one of the things we've been doing is trying to understand when water is available for the plants to use. And we've installed these soil moisture sensors into the soils, into the peat, to assess that, at which point during a drying period, shown by these red lines, does the soil dry out enough that that water is no longer reaching the surface of the bog and wicking up from the water table. And that then affects the ability for the roots, which are above the water table, to take up water, and then creates more stress for the plants. Indeed, during the 2021 drought, we saw reduced transpiration, reduced carbon uptake. Another thing we've been looking at with the sap flow, and these are the sap flow sensors that measure transpiration rates through the trees, is that during these heat waves that they're not able to recover at night. And so we're seeing this high nocturnal transpiration during these heat waves where they're under hydraulic stress. They're not able to fulfill the demands of the foliage for water, and thus that causes some dieback, as we've seen in the plants. We are seeing this increases in sap flow for the tamarack, but not for the larch. And this means that the tamarack are sort of hanging out there a little bit more than the spruce. They're willing to be under a little bit more stress at the risk of hydraulic failure, but at the gain of photosynthesis. Another interesting thing we've seen out there is that while the shrubs have really improved their growth, they're doing a lot better due to increased nutrient availability. They are seeing some stress in the Chamaedaphne, particularly some water stress, and we're not sure, but we are seeing a correlation with increases in herbivory by a Lepidoptera moth caterpillar shown here on the right, the bottom right. So towards the end of the season, a lot of the Chamaedaphne in the warmer plots are dead. And this, I think, is my last slide. This is basically another way we're doing some measurements. This is showing some LiDAR measurements that we're able to look at the structure of the vegetation and how that changes over time. We're seeing an increase in leaf area index, and so there is apparently some benefit of the warming. It's increasing growth, but at the risk of greater hydraulic stress. That is also reflected in changes in the display of the canopy, the shrubbiness of the branches, the thickness of the leaves. So we're seeing lots of things there, and that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Great, and thanks to all of our speakers. Now we've got a few questions here in the chat. So a question from Mark: I've noticed the spruce bog on my land in central Carleton County is quickly turning into a tamarack forest. The existing small tamarack growth has really accelerated the last 4 years of drought, with many smaller tamaracks sprouting too. Is this natural succession, drought, and or warming driven, or all of the above?
We're seeing some of the same sort of thing in the spruce bogs with the tamarack, and particularly the younger tamarack that are growing. They're growing very rapidly in the warmest plots, and I don't know if that's a temperature response. I think it's likely a temperature response, but it's also reflecting a drying soil environment, I think. And so it is something we are tracking through time at Spruce.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And is the forestry community's current emphasis on managing above ground forest carbon banks misguided? Is it more useful to focus efforts on restoring and stabilizing the function of below ground carbon banks like Minnesota's peatlands? And in some cases, this could mean plugging and deforesting previously drained peatlands.
Yeah, I answered that question briefly there. I could go into maybe a little more detail. And so one neat stat is that these peatland ecosystems on the planet house, they only occupy about 3% of the terrestrial area, but they house about 30% of the below ground carbon. So keeping that below ground soil carbon pool where it is really important for our future climate. And to be honest, the upland management we do in the state is relatively insignificant to those carbon pools that are actually in the peatlands. So stabilizing those carbon pools and adding to those carbon pools would be a much bigger bang for the buck than trying to add carbon to an upland system. You can add significant carbon to upland systems in like mine reclamation sites in places that have very little carbon in the soil. But it's all about the carbon in the soil, not necessarily the carbon above ground that is going to drive how our future climate is going to, or how it's going to go down. So definitely keep that soil carbon, and I'm a soil scientist, but I'm not biased here, I don't think. Keep that soil carbon where it is, independent of ecosystem, but especially peatlands, and add to it if we can.
Great. Thanks, Randy. And a comment from Casey: I've seen lots of soil subsidence based on perch trees and peat organic soils, which have dried and warmed in the last 50 years. Any other questions or comments in the chat? We've got a few minutes yet.
We've seen some of that. We've seen some of that subsidence at Spruce in the warmest plots. I mean, those peats, those wetlands really hold a lot of water, and as they dry out, they shrink substantially down. And so that actually the elevation in the warmest plots has dropped by inches since we've turned on the treatments, and part of that is due to the drying out, but I think part of that is, as Randy mentioned, is due to the loss of that soil carbon.
Thanks all. And question from Bill, or comment: empirical differences could be from change in air movement from your treatment shelters. How are you controlling for this? I'm also wondering about shift in actual snow entry and the natural effects of wind on what is intercepted by the canopy. And I can paste that in chat here. It's also in the Q&A section here.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, these chambers are artificial, and we do have forced air blowing around inside those plots. We are able to maintain a fairly good distribution of temperature within the plots, but there are certainly some trees. If you visited the site, you'll see some trees or shrub areas directly in front of the blowers that are getting excessive temperature and excessive loss of foliage, excessive stress. When we measure the trees in the above ground portion of the plants, we often try to stay away from those visibly direct effects of the air movement in there. And basically, the warmest spots are right in front of those vents, but it dissipates pretty quick. And we do have the open top, and that creates a lot of exchange with the atmosphere. Obviously, we're using a lot of energy to do this experiment, but being open allows circulation, allows cool air to flow in, allows breezes to sort of penetrate into the plots. And so
I think another key, I'm sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I just say another key to that again is the emphasis on our unchambered controls. And so we understand that there's going to be differences inside and outside the chambers, and there are differences in the amount of precip. There's huge differences in wind patterns and wind. But that's why we have the unchambered controls, where we can assess sort of those caveats that go along with the chambers and put our findings into the correct context. But you're right, there is definitely some chamber effects on the humidity and other things inside the chambers. But we hope we correct or consider that when we talk about our results. There was a question from Emily about decommissioning and what does that look like. I can grab that one real quick, Lane, if you like. It's kind of up to the Forest Service on what we want the place to look like. We've considered going longer than 10 years and with the plan, but there's a number of factors that are going to lead us to probably closing the doors on 10 years. And at least one of them is the maintenance costs for the experiment is starting to increase as a result of the infrastructures being timed out at 10, 15, 20 years. And so some of the infrastructure we are fixing a lot these days. And the other part is we really couldn't get a cohesive new question together that people were going to sort of scramble to like we did originally. And so I think DOE is going to move on to their next big thing, whatever that is. And maybe Jeff has some information on what that might be. I don't know for sure, but at this point in time, we're going to shut her down and at the end of 2025. And at least from a Forest Service perspective, I think we're going to take everything above ground off. So all the chambers are coming off, but we're leaving everything below ground, the plots and the footprints and the boardwalks in, just because it would be so much disturbance to take the below ground stuff, more than the disturbance to put it in. So I think that's what it's going to look like, Emily.
And a follow-up question from Bill, do your unchambered controls have heating of the peat?
No. We don't have a control where we have soil heating, but no chambers.
Great. And maybe one final question here from Mark. Have any elected officials expressed interest in your SPRUCE results?
Elected, good question. We've certainly had some biggies here from our agencies. In fact, the head person from DOE is coming in next week, actually, and I won't be here, but she'll be here. Chief of the Forest Service has been there. We've gotten kudos from some of the state senators and some things, but we've never had one actually visit the site as of yet.
Great.
I think
just
our
a reminder
biggest supporter so far to this point, Lane, has been Amy Klobuchar. She's indicated her support and things like that, but she just hasn't been able to make it to the site.
Great. Well, just a friendly reminder for folks in chat, we've pasted the link to get CEs, so just copy and paste that short link and let me know if there's any trouble accessing that. But otherwise, thanks so much to our presenters, Randy and Jeff and Andrew. Hopefully folks got a lot out of this, and we'll be posting it online if you missed any parts, and we can share that and the like. But otherwise, our next webinar is on October 10th at 9 a.m. as usual on the second Tuesday of the month. We'll be diving a bit more into some carbon topics. But thanks again to our speakers, and thank you all for attending today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.